Now, let's get to the main topic. So, today's topic is capitalism and the First Amendment. And unfortunately, capitalism has gotten a really bad rap, particularly among people of our generation. I'm barely still of your generation. All right, so I'm going to hold on to that signifier as long as I possibly can. Too many young Americans don't know anything about capitalism. They don't know why it's good. They think socialism is good. There's a Harvard Institute of Politics poll in spring 2016, and it found that Bernie Sanders, that loon bag, was the only major candidate with a net positive rating among 18 to 29-year-olds. 54% viewed him favorably, compared with just 31% who viewed him unfavorably. And now they're making the argument we should lower the voting age to 16. I can't see how that goes wrong. The same poll showed that only 42% of young Americans supported capitalism. 33% said they supported socialism, as in full-scale socialism. Like 1 in 3 young Americans supports full-scale socialism. Fully 50% of all Democratic voters said they favored socialism over capitalism. 1 in 2. That's probably because young people are too young to remember when socialist nations like the USSR actually threatened nuclear destruction, when they murdered tens of millions of people. I mean, there still are some there's still some Soviet-style dictatorships, right? The communist Chinese are still imprisoning millions and billions of people under repressive, harsh rule. North Korea, obviously, is still a communist paradise where people are shipped off to gulags. But the idea of socialism has become very popular among young people. And the reason that it's become popular among young people is because they've been told that it is moral. Not that it works, not that it's great, but that it's moral. It's fair. And we all like things that are fair. If we're in a room and somebody has more money and somebody has less money, wouldn't it be more fair if we just pooled the money and then we split it up evenly among the participants? You know, just like the cookies in kindergarten. Except, of course, that's not the way the world works, and that's not actually moral. Because in a free country, wealth and the capacity to gain it is largely contingent on the decisions that you make. It doesn't just fall upon you. Most wealth in the United States is not inherited. Most wealth in the United States is created over the course of lifetimes by people who engage in economic activity and commerce. Capitalism is good because capitalism is freedom. Socialism is bad because socialism is tyranny. Not as an aspect of tyranny, socialism itself is tyranny. The statement of socialism is that your labor is owed to the society. The notion of socialism is that you do not own your own freedom. You do not own your own time. You do not own your own labor. You do not own your own work. You do not own the products of your own work. The basic notion of capitalism is you own all of those things, and now you have to engage in free exchange with someone else who does not owe you anything. If you want to thrive, if you want to succeed, you are going to have to make something somebody else wants. People think capitalism is selfishness. No, socialism is selfishness. The notion that I have to somehow supply you the money so you can sit in your basement and paint with watercolors. Socialism, the idea that I'm supposed to fulfill all your dreams by paying you for something I don't want and have no need for. But capitalism is precisely the opposite. We all do stuff in our daily jobs that we don't like. Why? Because there's a group for it who want to consume it. How many people love their daily job every day? I'm lucky. I get to go to a job that I really enjoy every day. But a lot of people don't. And you know why they do it? They do it because they understand that in a free society, they're going to have to produce something that is not entertaining and interesting only to them. If my podcast had one listener, I would have to quit podcasting. And if whatever business you go into has no customers, your business will go out of business. As I'm fond of saying, capitalism is forced altruism. It forces you to do something that somebody else wants if you want to live. Socialism is forced altruism in a different way. It's forcing your altruism to me. Right? So capitalism is about I have to be forced to do something good for you in order for me to live. And socialism is about the idea that I have to be forced to do something for you so that you can live. That's not the same thing at all. Capitalism also happens to be the most efficient system for the distribution of wealth in the history of mankind. It is the greatest it is the greatest engine for growth in the history of mankind. It is the single greatest force for the empowerment of individual human beings in the history of mankind. So, why is it unpopular after all this is said? It's unpopular because it's very easy to demagogue capitalism. Any policy that has diffuse costs and concentrated benefits is a popular policy by nature. Right? Any policy that has diffuse costs and concentrated benefits is going to be popular. So subsidies, for example, to farmers in Iowa, those are popular because farmers in Iowa get a big chunk of cash, and you only lost 1 cent off your paycheck, so you didn't even see it, you didn't even notice it. Well, socialism is sort of the same idea. If you don't notice the money coming off your paycheck, then you're not going to notice that that one person is getting a bunch of money. So that person benefits, and that person feels good about the benefits they just received, but you don't even notice the money coming off. Except that in a socialist system, you have to take so much money off the top that everybody notices, of course. Now, socialism in and of itself, as I say, is tyrannical. It is evil. Socialism violates at least 3 of the 10 commandments. It puts government before God. It says that theft is fine. Theft is no longer a problem so long as you and your friends vote for it. And of course, petty jealousy is something that is necessary. It's good to be jealous. Workers of the world must unite, not because they're necessarily being grinded down by the boot heel of capitalism, but simply because they are jealous of the achievements of others. So much of America's discussion right now about income inequality is not about the suffering poor. So much of it is about the so-called thriving rich, the 1% at the top. It's about tearing down the people who succeed, not about empowering the people who are failing. If we were really talking about helping the poor, we'd be talking about helping the poor, not income inequality. Income inequality itself does nothing. That discussion does nothing to help the poor. What we have to talk about is ways that we can help people who are poor rise out of current circumstance through better decision-making and better opportunity. How about socialism in Europe? So people who are defenders of socialism and say, okay, well, you guys always mention Cuba, you always mention North Korea, you always mention the USSR, you always mention China. Well, they say China's growing. China's growing because they loosened up their economy, and now it's basically state capitalism. But then they say, well, what about the socialistic countries of Europe? So this is Bernie Sanders' play. And what about Denmark? What about Switzerland? What about Sweden? Those are not socialist countries. Those are capitalist countries with a high tax system. Okay, that's not the same thing. A socialist country is government owns the means of production. It is about heavy regulation of all parts of the economy. Denmark is actually a better climate to do business than the United States is, according to the Heritage Foundation. Significantly better. There's a lot of foreign investment in Denmark. What makes Denmark a so-called socialist country is the fact that it has 60% tax rates. That's also the reason their economy stagnated so much that they just had to radically cut their tax rates. The same thing is true in Sweden. Sweden gained riches only after embracing capitalism in the mid-19th century. From 1975 to 1993, when they put in place all of these social programs with high levels of spending and high levels of taxation, the country dropped from 4th in the world wealth ranking to 14th. Swedish scholar Nima Sandanji called the country's embrace of redistributionism a colossal failure, which is why they had to liberalize their markets again. Okay, again, back to income inequality for a second. What about this idea that socialism cures the evils of income inequality? First of all, every country on earth has some level of income inequality. In fact, some of the places with the least income inequality are also some of the poorest places on earth. There are places where everybody is destitute. If you go over to certain countries in Africa or Asia, everyone is poor and there's no income inequality. Does that mean that these are great places to live? No, it means these are horrible places to live because nobody has any wealth. America has high levels of income inequality, but our poor are richer than everybody else's poor, which is the thing that matters. In the United States, even the poor people are rich by global standards. According to Pew Research, quote, almost 9 in 10 Americans had a standard of living that was above the global middle income standard. And by the way, the notion that the middle class has been just taking it on the chin in the past few decades in the United States, this is not true. The upper middle class has been picking up all the people who used to be in the middle class. It's not that the middle class devolved into poverty, it's that the middle class split, and most of the middle class became upper middle class. The upper middle class was just 12% of Americans in 1979. As of 2014, 30% of Americans were now upper middle class. And it's also worth noting that all of our schemes to end income inequality have been an enormous fail. We spent $22 trillion in the war on poverty to no avail. We spend $30,000 per year on poor non-elderly families. And that's paid for by the rich. For all the talk about income inequality and the rich not paying their fair share, the rich are paying pretty much everything. Statistically speaking, people who are high earners in this country are paying virtually all net cost that the federal government incurs. According to the CBO report on distribution of taxes in 2013, the top 1% of households paid 34% of their income to federal taxes. The middle 20% paid just 13%. According to the American Enterprise Institute, the highest income quintile is financing 96% of the entire system of transfer payments to the bottom 60% and funding the functioning of the federal government as well. We actually have the most progressive tax system among all OECD 24 countries. For all the talk about how all the rich people are getting rich in the United States and the poor people are getting poor, we have the most progressive tax system in all of the OECD. And income mobility has not declined either. This is another myth that's pushed out there, that if you're poor, you can never become rich in the United States. This is not true at all. When people talk about the people in the 1% getting richer, they forget. You will be in the 1% one day, and you may not be in the 1% one day. I've been not in the 1%. I've been in the 1%. I assume at some point in the future, I won't be in the 1% by income earning anymore. If people move in and out of percentiles of income, it's not the same person. It's not that you were born into the 1% and then you stayed in the 1% your entire life just getting more wealthy. In fact, statistically speaking, if you were in the 1%, there's a pretty good shot that you're going to regress to the mean. For those who were in the top 1% in 1996, and we're not talking about the 1% bracket, we're talking about the actual people in the 1% in 1996, by 2005, their income had decreased on average by 26%. And income mobility works the other way too. According to Thomas Sowell, a University of Michigan study showed most of the working people who were in the bottom 20% of income earners in 1975 were also in the top 40% at some point by 1991. Only 5% of those in the bottom quintile in 1975 were still there in 1991. 29% of them were now in the top quintile. That makes a lot of sense. Right now, there are a lot of people in this room who are in the bottom or middle income quintile because you're in college. You're not making money. In 10 years, you will be making money, presumably. And when that happens, you will have moved up in the world. As you age, you gain more wealth. This is why your grandmother owns a house, but you presumably do not yet. Okay, this will happen to all of you. So don't pay attention to the false statistics that are being put out there about how in America it's impossible to get ahead. That's just not true. Also worth noting, all the talk about the United States sucking up all the wealth of the world, it is because of a capitalist global system that has become more and more prominent, free markets that have become more and more prominent, that literally half the world has been lifted out of abject poverty since 1980. That's because of the force and power of the U.S. free market economy that has been driving all of that growth. The countries, by the way, that are poor in the world, those countries are not the ones that are being hurt by free trade. They're the ones that aren't even participating in free trade. 2/3 of the global poor on planet Earth live in just 5 countries: India, China, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Congo. According to the Heritage Foundation Index of Economic Freedom, every single one of those countries ranks 120th or below in terms of free markets. This is not a coincidence. Freer markets means more wealth. Freer markets mean more growth. Okay, now, on to the second issue we're going to talk about, and that, of course, is free speech. And this one, obviously, has become a more pressing concern than even the capitalism conversation, simply because of all of the hubbub surrounding events like this one. We've been told that we have to hold events like this one and places far away from main campuses because we might make someone feel uncomfortable. And if those people feel uncomfortable, then they get to exercise the heckler's veto. And we have to move the entire event away from fora that host 1,500 people and into smaller venues that host 500 people. And we have to put 300 people on the wait list. Because obviously we wouldn't want to offend anyone. Those people outside, they're the people in the right, the people protesting. Again, it's fine for them to protest. But the people who are either protesting or who are threatening and necessitated the taxpayer dollars going toward the use of 100 police officers tonight, those people are the problem. You are not the problem. I am not the problem. The people who are creating the threats that require the spending of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to hold events like this one, those people are the problem. And unfortunately, their philosophy is a growing one. The idea that if we say stuff that's offensive, this is a form of violence. And therefore, violence can be used in response, and that's why we need to bring in police officers in order to protect all of this. This is just an aspect of identity politics. How is it that when I say something, this is an aspect of violence? Because I'm attacking someone's identity. Don't you see? It's not just that I'm saying something with which you disagree, it's that I'm attacking your identity. So when I say socialism is stupid and capitalism is good, there are some people who feel offended by this. When I suggest that in a free country, you should be able to rise as an individual if you just do some simple things, if you make some simple good decisions, then this is seen as offensive by certain people to their identities. If I say that white privilege is not a thing, if I say that just because you were born white in the United States does not mean that you are bound to succeed, and that if you were born black in the United States that you are bound to fail, this is seen as an attack on identity. Now, what makes any of this an attack on identity? The victim mentality that purports to suggest that every failure you have is due to the color of your skin, or the area in which you were born, or the religion that you practice. All of this is nonsense. But when I say that, it makes people feel bad. It makes people feel bad because it's a lot easier to blame everybody else for your problems than it is to take responsibility for your own problems. Now, this is not to say there's no such thing as discrimination. Of course there is. It's not to say there aren't people who are suffering from racism or bigotry. Of course there are people who are suffering from those things. But we are all on their side. There's not a person in this room, I would imagine, who sees a racist incident, a clearly racist incident, and doesn't feel terrible about it and doesn't seek to help. I don't know a lot of people out there in the United States who are looking around going, look at that terrible racist incident, I'm so happy that happened. And if they are, they're not coming to my speeches. Right? Those aren't the people who are showing up and listening to what I have to say. Those are the people who are going and listening to the alt-right, maybe. Those are some of the people who are listening to members of the radical left. Those aren't people who are showing up to mainstream conservative speeches. But again, if you challenge the notion that we live in a victim-first culture, if you challenge the notion that in a free country you can succeed, then this is bound to make people feel really bad. And so white privilege, microaggressions, trigger warnings, this has become the order of the day on college campuses. And the way this works is that we now judge you not by the content of your character, but by the color of your skin. We are supposed to discern whether your view is good or bad, not by what you have to say, but simply by who you are. So because we have a white privileged country, a country filled with privileged white people, built by white people for white people, because of all of that, if you are a white person, then you have to take a ticket and go to the back of the line when it comes to the views that you get to express. Or you have to shut up entirely. Now, never mind that there are minority groups in the United States who are making a lot more money on a per capita basis than white people are in the United States. Right? Jews were a minority group in the United States. They're still a minority group in the United States now for purposes of the census. They've been considered white, but for a long time they were barred from country clubs, for example. Jews on average earn more than the average white person does in the United States if you count them as a separate census group. Same thing is true for Asian Americans. Asian Americans have the single greatest income on a family level of any group in the United States. Is that because of Asian privilege? Is that because of Jewish privilege in the United States? Or is that because there are a lot of people in these particular subgroups who work really hard and have a culture that pushes working really hard? That has nothing to do with race. That has everything to do with the decisions that are made by parents to raise their children in a particular way with a particular viewpoint on hard work. But again, white privilege has to be the order of the day so that people don't feel bad about themselves. Well, I'm here to suggest that if you're failing in the freest country in the world, and you can't point to actual evidence of discrimination against you, you should feel bad about yourself. Because you've done something wrong. You've failed. You've made bad decisions. Maybe you're not working hard enough. Now, I'm not saying that people who, of course, are born with problems, people who have mental illness, people who have physical disability, people who are obviously born behind the 8 ball in terms of what they can achieve, that's something that's different. But I'm talking about the normal, average, everyday American of any race, any color, any creed. If you're failing in the United States right now, there's a really good shot it's because you did something stupid. The reality is, according to the Brookings Institute, which is a left-leaning institute, I've cited this fact many, many times, virtually everyone in the United States who has done these 3 things will never be permanently poor. Get a job, finish high school, don't have babies before you're married. That's it. You do those 3 things in the United States, you will not be permanently poor. As I've always said, you are capable of doing all of these 3 things. You're all here, you're all in college, that means you finished high school. You're all capable of getting a job, I assume, even poli-sci majors. I know, I was one. And you're all capable of not having a baby until you're married. As I always say, just don't put that thing there without that other thing on it. It's not that difficult. Somehow people, for dozens of years, have been avoiding pregnancies that they didn't want. So, all of this is to say that if we are going to start shutting down free speech, if we're going to start throwing out particular viewpoints because of the identity of people, this is a form of tyranny. And free speech matters because if we don't have free speech, then minority viewpoints, viewpoints that were once minority, can never become majority. One of the great ironies of this whole situation is that it's minority interest groups that have been taking the lead on shutting down free speech. But if free speech had been shut down in 1960, you would not have gay rights, you would not have civil rights, you would not have women's rights. All of these issues were at one point minority issues. Now they are majority issues. What turns a minority issue into a majority issue is our capacity to debate it and reason through it and have conversations about it. But now there are a bunch of folks who want to shut that door, who want to say, listen, we've got the perfect society, we've got our utopia, we're dominant politically, and now everybody else has to shut up. That's not the way that this works. The way this works is we all get to have a conversation together. And if you have a problem with that, then you're un-American. Because this was the basis of a free and open society. The notion that we could discuss with each other, that we weren't going to question each other's motives first and foremost, that we were going to reason with one another. The whole basis of a republic is the idea that we are rooted in reason. I'm writing a book right now on everything moving from ancient philosophy to modern philosophy. It's a real page-turner. And the entire premise of Western civilization is that freedom is predicated on the idea that we can discuss with one another without relying on identity as the trump card. Once identity becomes the trump card, how the hell are we going to have a conversation? Because all you do is just shout, you can't understand me, I'm black, and all I do is shout, you can't understand me, I'm Jewish. Okay, well then the conversation is over, and I guess we ought to just go get our mallets and hit each other. Because that's the only way that any of this is going to get resolved. That's not the way things are supposed to work. Unfortunately, we're seeing it play out that way in virtually every political debate, the gun debate just being the most obvious lately. Folks suggesting, both people who are witnesses to the shooting down in Parkland and members of the media suggesting that if you disagree with them, then it's because you're an uncaring, bad human being. You can't hold political conversation with folks who are calling you evil. Just a basic rule of political discussion. So here's my recommendation. If you believe in freedom, if you believe in individual rights, if you believe that you own your labor, if you believe you own your time, if you believe in the capacity of the other person across the table from you to have a conversation, then everybody needs to embrace a free market, and everybody needs to embrace a free market of ideas. Thanks so much. Happy to take your question. So now the fun part. So, as always, I have a standing rule. If you disagree with me on any matter under the sun, raise your hand, you go first.
All right, so how this is going to work is we're going to have people go around the back and line up in a line along one side of the aisle, and then you'll come here, stand on the pink X. I'll hold the microphone for you, and then you can ask your one question, okay?
1 minute long.
Yep. We ready? Yep, right on pink X. Good?
Howdy, go for it.
Hello. I see a lot of similarities between you and Jordan Peterson. What are your thoughts on the Jordan Peterson revolution?
I mean, I love Jordan. I know Professor Peterson relatively well at this point, and I think he's doing an awful lot of good. We looked at each other the other day. We were having a conversation on Dave Rubin's show, and we looked at each other and we said, how is it that we found a huge market for saying things like, take responsibility for your own life and tell the truth? Like, how is this a big market proposition? And it just shows the radicalism of society right now, that this is considered an underground subversive thought when you say, make good decisions and maybe you'll have a better life. So the fact that Jordan says that, the fact that I say that, I think that, all credit to Jordan. I think that he's a really interesting thinker. I like his lectures on religion. Our divisions are largely about whether it's a matter of religion being useful or religion being true. But we start from the same fundamental premises about the value of reason in a society that seems to have lost its mind. And so good for Jordan. I mean, that interview with Kathy Newman is everything, right? The interview with him on BBC, which I talked about on my show, is just spectacular because being Kathy Newman is something that everybody on the right has to go through. If you're on the right, the media will take your views, pretend that those are not your views, that instead what you actually believe is something vile, evil, and nasty, and then attribute those views to you in front of you. And Jordan is one of the people who I've sort of deemed the Bartleby group for fans of Melville. There's just a certain group of people who just say no. Right? I'm not going to do that. And Jordan is one of those people. I think there are people on the left, by the way, who are like this. I think Sam Harris is one of those people, somebody who I disagree with strenuously on a lot of topics. But when he was on with Bill Maher and talking about the problems with fundamentalist Islam, and Ben Affleck went after him, he basically said, no, I'm not going to do that. And I think that a society that's so skewed, that simply saying no to basic propositions that are false is now popular. It says more about our society than it says about either Jordan or me. We were looking at each other and going, are we the best that society has to offer right now? Are we the best thinkers? Because if so, we are so screwed.
First of all, I just wanted to say I'm a huge fan of yours. You've distracted me from my own school because you're like my new school. I obsessively watch your videos.
What's your major?
I'm a business administration major.
Okay, so you may be learning more from me then.
I mean, I've learned more about like capitalism and like how our system actually works from you than like any other class.
Oh, thank you, I appreciate it.
But yeah, my question was, what is your opinion on labels in general? So like, obviously, there's a difference between leftists and liberals.
Yes.
Do you think it's important to like say like, so saying, if you say I'm a conservatism or I'm a conservative, but yet you hold some leftist views or some liberal views, do you think you should be saying like, I should be saying I'm a conservative then?
I mean, so I think that if I were to make a fundamental distinction between conservative thought and leftist thought, conservative thought says that when in conflict, individual rights trump communal rights, and leftist thought says that when in conflict, communal rights trump individual rights. That's the very shorthand, very, very shorthand description of the ideologies. Obviously, there's some play in the definitions. If in the best of all possible worlds, we would all be able to have just a giant list of our issue resumes, all the things we feel about various issues, and then we wouldn't have to use labels. But it's useful shorthand. The truth is that you can usually tell within 5 minutes of talking to somebody, at least I can, where they stand politically on the spectrum. And if you are conservative because you believe in personal responsibility and individual rights that pre-exist government, and a government that was designed specifically in order to protect those rights, not in order to provide you positive rights, not in order to give you things that belong to other people, then you are conservative even if you may stray on various smaller issues, I think. Thanks.
Hey, Mr. Shapiro, thanks for coming. It's a great honor to listen to you speak and
Thank you.
coming all the way out to Minnesota in the cold. So we all know your opinions and feelings about Donald Trump and why you chose not to vote for him in the election cycle. I guess my question is is there ever a point where you think it's more important to stop a radical leftist ideology or candidate rather than vote for someone who adequately promulgates conservative ideology and morals? Or I guess, in simpler words, does the lesser of two arguments, or the lesser of two evils argument, ever hold water for you?
So I think the lesser of evils argument can hold water, but you have to be talking about something that is an absolute incurable evil. Because otherwise what you do is you fall into a trap where every single election becomes a lesser of two evils argument, which is basically what we've had for since Reagan, I'd say. It's a serious problem because all the parties have to do is run somebody who's slightly less crappy than the other party, and then we're all supposed to throw up our hands and say, oh, hallelujah, we just saved the country by voting for someone. Now, this is not a referendum on what President Trump has done so far. I like a lot of what President Trump has done policy-wise. I'm far more skeptical of President Trump rhetorically. I think that the president has done, continues to do severe damage to the comedy in the country and the possibility of building a social fabric, which I actually think is a really important thing. That said, I never said during the election cycle that I didn't understand the lesser of two evils argument. I just didn't think it applied simply because I thought that there was another long-term consideration, which was what happens if, for example, Trump is so unpopular that even if he gives me some of the things I want, he blows out conservatism. In 2018, the Republicans lose Congress, and in 2020, Kamala Harris is president with a Democratic Congress. Right? That was a serious political consideration. Also, there are serious considerations about the views of young people that are being shaped right now in electoral politics. If they look at President Trump and they see him as the face of conservatism, is that too toxic? And is that going to be what people see of conservatism now? Is the guy who, during the campaign, pretended he didn't know what the KKK was, for example, right? That was my main critique of Trump as a candidate. Now, we're a year and a half past his election, and there's new evidence. So some of the evidence suggests that he is actually governing like a conservative. I think a lot of the damage that I was afraid of him doing to the country basically has already occurred. So the question is, how much more damage can he do to the country on some of these levels? I don't know that the answer is all that high. I think that he's basically become, what I've said is he's now the strong efficient markets theory, right? That all the information is now priced in. He could legitimately shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and no one's opinion of him would change. Right? He could come out front of the White House and strangle puppies, and everybody who likes him would say that puppy absolutely deserved it. And everybody who dislikes him would say that he does this on a routine basis. We'll have to evaluate where we are in 2020 because it's 3 years away. But in answer to your original question, does it ever apply? Yes, it applies, but I think that we have to be very sparing about its use because it's very easy to move from lesser of two evils argument to the end justifies the means. Right? Those two arguments are closely related, and the ends justifies the means argument is one of the most dangerous arguments a human being can make.
Would you vote for Donald Trump if the election were today?
If the election were today, I'd lean toward it. Because, again, I think that the president has done a lot of things I didn't think he was going to do. And I think that the system has constrained him in ways that, were unforeseen. Also, I think most of the damage that he has done and continues to do has already been done. I think that if all the damage has been done, if the hole is already in the boat, I'm not sure that the situation is bettered by a Democrat taking over with the hole in the boat at this point.
All right. I'll preface my question by saying that I admire your work for a number of different reasons, and perhaps what I find most admirable about you is your strict sense of ethnic and religious identity as a Jew. Your Jewish background has clearly played a significant role in influencing or shaping the political, social, and cultural ideals and values that you have, as well as your support for Israel as a nation state. So, I'm wondering, Ben, do you support the classical definition of a nation as being demographically and culturally homogenous, like that of Israel, similar to the definition that American forefathers generally upheld, with exceptions, of course, until the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965?
Okay, so one, I want to correct a mischaracterization. You said that I take a lot of pride in my ethnic and religious identity. I take no pride in my ethnic identity. I take a lot of pride in my religious identity. So there are a lot of people who have been born Jews who I just don't care about. Right? Like Noam Chomsky was born Jewish. He's a schmuck. Like I don't care at all. Bernie Sanders, born Jewish, schmuck. Like I don't. So the point that I'm making is that religious identity is a different thing because that's a set of ideas and values. Religion is creedal. In the same way the American Declaration of Independence is creedal. So when it comes to the definition of a nation, I would say that it is very important that a nation have a creed in common. I'm not particularly interested in having an ethnicity in common. When they say that Israel, for example, is ethnically homogenous, that's just not true. Israel is filled with Russian Jews and Ethiopian Jews and Yemeni Jews. My wife is a Moroccan Jew. So just because they all have a religion in common doesn't make them ethnically identical by any stretch of the imagination. Right? Again, it's pretty hard to find somebody who's more ethnically non-identical than a Russian Jew and an Ethiopian Jew. So the reason that I believe in Israel as a nation state is not for ethnic reasons, it's because of religious observance reasons, that Israel is a place where the religion of Judaism can thrive and be safe, which I think is an important thing. And I think the same thing is true in the United States when it comes to the creed of the United States. I think America is a creedal country. I think it's what has made America great. Now, that's not to say that everybody who comes into the country has an equal capacity to assimilate to that creed. The assimilation capacity of people, I don't think, has to do much with ethnic identity. I think it does have to do with cultural identity. I think there are cultures that come into the country, people who come from various cultures, who may not be as easily able to assimilate, because obviously that's just the case. I mean, there are people who come in and they already know English. There are people who come in and they've already had a history with Western democracy. There are people who come in and they've never seen a gay person before, and in their old country, gay people were caned and killed. So it's important to recognize that cultures are not the same thing as ethnicities. And I think it's a dangerous game to play when we say that that ethnicity means culture when they clearly do not mean anything of the sort.
Hey Ben, how are you?
Doing okay, how are you?
I'm good. So unlike everyone else here, I'm actually a high schooler. I'm the secretary of our Young Americans for Freedom Charter.
Great.
And we fought really hard to try to get you to come to our school too, but they shut us down every way they could. I know I gotta keep this short, but I wanted to ask you, what's the best way as secretary I can reach out to young people who may not know what conservatism is, and how can I inspire them to join the movement that pretty much you lead?
Well, that's very kind of you. Not sure I lead it, but that's nice of you. I think that as far as how to get people to join the movement, people join movements because they see flashpoints in culture. Right? The way that people most engage, I can tell this from the way that people sort of find my content. Most of the people who listen to my show, for example, originally engaged because they saw a short video of me on YouTube or Facebook talking about race or transgenderism or something. And then they use that as sort of a gateway drug to actually see the rest of what I was talking about. And I think that the same holds true for politics in most situations. So the important thing if you're pushing conservatism is to find the flashpoints. This is true for everybody in politics, right, left, and center, so it's also true for conservatives. And that is, you find a flashpoint that inherently supports your position, and then you say, this is why you need to get politically engaged. And you have to find out what the person is really interested in. Not everybody is interested in the same issues. There's some people who are very interested in the unborn. There are some people who are very interested in gun rights. I see the NRA hat. There are a bunch of people who are very interested in economic liberty. There are a bunch of people who are libertarian and just don't want the government involved in their business. And so you have to sort of identify what issue motivates somebody as a general rule, and then determine how you make the approach politically on a hot button issue that's in the news, because that's first people have to be interested, and what makes people interested is those hot button flashpoints in politics. It's not you telling somebody to go out and read Frederick Hayek. It's not going to happen.
Would it be all right if I got a picture with you?
I'd be happy to do that after. I think that we'll probably try and stick around a little bit, do that.
Hi.
Howdy.
So let's say hypothetically there's a young man here who is dating a young woman who tends to lean very far left.
So sorry. Before you go any further, is she present right now?
No, she is not.
Okay, good. So I can be honest. All right.
So how might, do you have any advice for how this young man might go about exposing her to some new ideas without the relationship crashing and burning?
Oh, you're an optimist. Okay. So, you, my friend, are making a very large mistake. I'm sure she's wonderful. I'm sure she's supremely attractive. I'm sure all of those things. It depends what the relationship is for. Are you in it for marriage, or like you actually have to give me like what's the end goal here?
Yeah, marriage.
Okay, so if you're in it for marriage, then the number one thing you must have in common with your spouse is values. You don't have interests come after values. But most people are interested in lots of things. There are lots of interesting things in the world. Liking the same movies, liking the same art, virtually worthless. What is important is that you have the same value system. So politics are a reflection of values. Now, there are a lot of people who never connect their politics with their values. So you have to determine whether she's politically left because this represents some core values, or just because she's been told a bunch of slogans and now she repeats all these slogans. So when I first dated my wife, for example, my wife thought of herself as pro-choice. And then the more that we discussed the issue, it became very clear to her that she was actually pro-life and hadn't really considered the issue in a serious way. It was just she was told on college campus that it was a good thing to be pro-choice, and so she said she was pro-choice. And the same thing was true of gun rights, for example. She didn't know anything about guns. She'd been told guns were bad, and then when I explained gun rights to her, and when it turned out that her father was a member of the military, then she shifted a little bit. Politics is the tip of the iceberg. The question is whether your girlfriend's politics, or this unnamed person's girlfriend's politics, are a floating bit of flotsam on the top of the ocean, or whether there's actually a structural underpinning for what she's thinking. So you first have to determine that. If there is a structural underpinning, and if she really believes this stuff on a strong level, you're really going to have to think about whether this is something you want to go through for the next 80 years. Because when it comes time to raise your kids, forget about you. Okay, in my view, marriage, not relationships. Marriage is about bearing and rearing children, ideally. Right? My wife and I have 2 children. That is the end goal of marriage. That is the telos of marriage. Marriage was created so that we could bear and raise our children. And that means that we have to have very similar perspectives on how we want to raise our kids. Now, if you want to raise your kid with traditional ideas of virtue and decency, and she wants to raise your kids with traditional ideas of multiculturalism, for example, then and all cultures and all opinions being equal, all behavior being equal, this is going to be a real conflict when it comes time to parent your kids. So you have to ask yourself 2 questions. 1, is she movable? And 2, if she's not movable, what is your end goal here? Because, there's lots of fun to be had in life. But when it comes time for marriage, marriage is, as all the married people in the room know, marriage is not the time for fun. Marriage is, when it comes time for marriage, not totally true. I love my wife and we have a great marriage. But, see, I know she's watching. But when it comes time for marriage, it is deeply important that you put values before all of the other ancillary things. If you have values in common, your marriage can outlast anything. If you don't have values in common, then the first break and the thing's over.
Hey, Ben.
Hey.
I'm the founding chairman of the Young Americas for Freedom here on campus. We're almost an official group. You just have to recognize us. We have 2 people to go, so that's good news. I'm also a convert from Milo Yiannopoulos to you, which is pretty good. But my question...
you discovered virtue. Congratulations.
Yes. Thank you. One issue here on campus is renaming buildings. One of our buildings is named Kaufman Union. It's after one of our former presidents, and he's been accused of racism and anti-Semitism. In your opinion, should we apply today's values to the past in renaming monuments and buildings?
So, as a general rule, I think not. I think that monuments, the names on buildings, this is actually a good educational opportunity. I don't like the phrase teachable moment, but they usually are. So this idea that we're going to chip off all of the names from old buildings, I think that's foolish. I think it's actually very important as a country for us to face up to the problems that we've had in the past. So over at Princeton, there's the Woodrow Wilson College over at Princeton, and they were talking about whether they were going to chip his name off the building. I think Woodrow Wilson was one of the worst presidents we ever had. I think Woodrow Wilson was a terrible human being. But I think it would be important to actually mention that. Right? He was the president of Princeton, and I think it's important to say, listen, there was a time in our history that racism was not just a thing, it was a dominant thing. There was a time in our history where the First Amendment was not protected. There was a time in our history where the birth of a nation was screened in the White House by this guy. Right? The movie about the glories of the KKK was screened in the White House for Woodrow Wilson. I think all of that is useful, and I think all of that is good, because if we don't know our history, number one, we don't know how far we've come, and number two, it's a reminder of how things can go bad if we revert back into our tribal nature. So I don't know anything about the person who you mentioned, but if it turns out that that person did a lot of terrible things, then I think it's important to recognize that people are people. There's a mixed legacy usually with a lot of these folks. Thomas Jefferson was one of the great thinkers in human history, and he held slaves, and he had 6 children by Sally Hemings. That is a horrible, evil thing to do. But that doesn't mean that everything that he ever did was terrible. So I think that it's important that we recognize what we've done right in the past, what we've done wrong in the past, and it's a mistake to obliterate history. I just think and that's not just my perspective. That's the perspective of Condoleezza Rice, who said the same thing, and I think she's absolutely correct.
Hey, Ben.
Howdy.
So I've been following you since your Piers Morgan interview years back. That was awesome. Question. So I hear you put a lot of emphasis on the free market, fixing, for example, like racism and being self-regulatory. A pure example of this is if a business refuses business to a minority, a competing business will pop up and steal the business of folks who found the former business immoral, and that will run the racist business out of business. If you're following me here.
No, I got you.
All right, so with a country so large as the United States, couldn't there still be enough niche market to keep the original business afloat? If there is enough of a niche market to keep it afloat, does the government have the responsibility to make it illegal to refuse service based on the color of someone's skin, or do you see that as government overreach setting bad precedent?
So I think that there's certainly niche markets for racism. I mean, there's still people who sell racist crap online and do just fine with it. But the question is, are these people who are going to thrive? And also, are we willing to sacrifice your right to freedom of association in order to crack down on a few bad actors? And this is always the question when it comes to rights. It's the same question with gun rights. Are we willing to crack down on hundreds of millions of, on 100 million gun owners in the United States in order to get the few bad actors? Are we willing to crack down on freedom of association for hundreds of millions of people in order so that we get a few bad actors, particularly when the market prevents these people from becoming wildly successful? They are punished by the market because if you're a racist, you can only cater to that niche as opposed to being able to cater to a broader possible audience. The best example of integration, by the way, through the free market is Woolworths, the Woolworths counter, which was boycotted in 1960 before the Civil Rights Act by a bunch of black students who walked in and they said that they wanted to be served. And the restaurant said, well, by local law, we cannot serve you. And they said, well, we're just going to sit here until you do. And pretty soon the entire Woolworths chain changed its segregation policy. And that's because there were a bunch of people who said, we're not going to shop there anymore. Right? The Montgomery bus boycott is another example of this sort of stuff working. I think that is effective. I think it's actually more effective now than it was then, because then you were at least bound by location. Right? What if there was no competing business that could find a place to rent across the street? Now everything's online. So you can get anything online. Now, all these people who are walking into Christian bakers and demanding that they serve their same-sex wedding. First of all, if you can't find a gay baker in the United States, I don't know where you live. But second of all... But second of all, there are lots of cake-making companies that you can go online and just buy a cake from them. And if that Christian is willing to lose the business, well, then the Christian's willing to lose the business. It seems to me that's a much better cure for the problem of supposed discrimination than saying that we are going as a government to regulate who you can and cannot serve as a client. As I pointed this out to Jimmy Kimmel, who was doing this, one of my favorite punching bags. Jimmy Kimmel was saying this about exactly this case with the gay bakers. And I said, well, Jimmy, I would like for you to write me a comedy routine about the nastiness and horrors of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and I demand you do so right now. Right? This is your skill set. How dare you deny me service? Just because I'm a conservative, you're going to deny me service? That's discrimination. How could you do such a thing? The same principle that allows Jimmy Kimmel to refuse me service allows the Christian couple to refuse to serve the same-sex wedding. And I'm pretty extreme when it comes to the freedom of association. I think that you should be able to reject anybody from your business you want to, even if you're a piece of crap and you reject people you really shouldn't.
Are you still going to push for a debate with Turner?
Oh, I'm happy to debate Jimmy Kimmel anytime, anywhere. You can wake me up in the middle of the night. Let's do it.
Hi, how's it going? So yeah, I was a socialist in 8th grade, actually, until I got cognitive dissonance watching your Piers Morgan interview. Mm-hmm. But since then, I'm a senior now in high school, and I founded the YAF chapter. And
good for you. That's great.
So yeah, I mean, it would be great if we could get a photo for publicity. It'd be great for the city.
Yeah, like I say, we'll try and get some photos afterward.
But so yeah, when you're arguing with atheists, in the end of the argument of morality, there's almost always a concession that there's no objective right or wrong. As a Christian or a religious person, how can we prove that there's an objective morality without explicitly citing religion?
So there's two basic approaches to morality, both of which rely on an unmoved mover. One is the more secular Greek approach, and one is the Judeo-Christian approach. The Judeo-Christian approach is revelation, right? Either in the Judaic version, God came down on a mountaintop and informed people what was good and what was right and what was wrong, and what we should do and what we should not. And in the Christian version, Jesus came to earth and gave a moral code. So there's revelation, and then there's the Greek teleology, which essentially suggests that there's an unmoved mover that caused the universe to be the way that it is, and in the very nature of the universe itself, you can discover rules for living. So this is the difference between the Aristotelian good, for example, and what you would consider just moral good. So you might say that something happens and that's bad or that's good. What Aristotle would say is it's not that something happens and it's bad or good, it's fit or unfit, meaning that certain things are created for certain purposes. So, for example, what makes a shovel good is its capacity to dig, right? So a good shovel, the way he uses good is this way. A good shovel is a shovel that you can dig with. A good man is a man who can reason, right? Because what man is uniquely created to do is reason. What human beings, or people, as Justin Trudeau would say, are capable of doing is reasoning. And so the more you use your reason, that is what you were put on earth to do. And then you can derive a certain set of rules. People were meant to do justice based on the nature of who people are. People were meant to get married and have babies based on the nature of what sex is. Right? So you can derive some rules from that. Now, that was basically, I would say, torn apart by a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, ranging from David Hume to Voltaire to Spinoza. But I don't know that they sufficiently reject that argument, because then they go find a moral system on their own, or either they find an arbitrary moral system or they try to reconstruct a moral system based on premises that are not available in nature. Right? They try to set up universal principles like Kant tries to do, but that's a universal principle Kant came up with, so it's inherently subjective. So you either, if you want an objective morality, you either have to go to the nature of things and try to derive from the nature of things what you ought to do. You have to connect to is and ought in a way that David Hume would not like, or you have to go to Revelation and say, here is what God actually said to human beings and instruct them to do. Now, the good news is that the vast majority of things that the Greeks thought were good are also the same things that are thought good in Judeo-Christian systems of thought, which is what Aquinas says, what Maimonides says, it's what Augustine says, even though he was attempting to draw some distinctions. Christianity, historically speaking, was maybe the first attempt to actually meld the thought of Judaic thought with Greek thought, which is why the New Testament is written in Greek as opposed to being written in Aramaic or Hebrew, which was the parlance at the time. So all of that is a very long way and a historical way to say that no one has yet come up with a system of morality that is objectively verifiable and that actually gives us all the things we want outside of the history that I just gave to you. So this is what I said to Sam Harris. So Sam Harris comes to a lot of the same moral conclusions that I do, right? That we have individual rights, and that we as individual human beings shouldn't hurt each other, and that we have the right to free speech, and that we have the right to property. And what I said to him is there's an entire 3,000 year history to get us to those rights. Right, born out of Judeo-Christian and Greek thought, and you're just taking the cherry off the top and proclaiming that this is obvious to everyone. And clearly that's not the case, because for the vast majority of people on Earth for all of human time, that is not true. And this has been our main disagreement. And again, I think that it's very difficult for Sam or for atheists generally to get to a moral system that is not arbitrary. It may be a system that I agree with. They may have morality that I agree with, but it's hard for them to say this is objectively true on any level without some appeal to either the nature of things or some appeal to God himself.
Hey, Ben, so I'm definitely a left-leaning student, but I listen to your podcast every day.
Well, thank you for coming and thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So my question is about race and culture. So while I agree with you that when you look at white America, it's silly to say that the majority of white Americans are actively trying to prevent you from getting to where you want to be. I'm East Indian, and I have definitely experienced some racism, but I never felt as though it keeps Indians from succeeding. So I do think there's a cultural component that supersedes the color of your skin. But I also think that it's naive to say that it just so happens that the same minority groups that have been historically oppressed happen to have cultures that are less conducive to success. I believe that environment can create culture. Can you acknowledge the historical reasonings that led to these so-called unsuccessful cultures and not put blame on these minority groups? I know that in your heart, I don't think you're a racist person, but in my opinion, to blame people for their failure, for their cultural failures without taking into consideration historical, the history in general conceals a lack of empathy and sort of hints at racism.
Okay, so I'll fight back on the last point that there's anything to do with empathy or racism here, but I fully agree with you. Like 100, not like 90%, like 100%. I think that bad cultures are generally the result of bad things that have happened in the past or bad modes of thought that have prevailed over time. So, for example, there's a great book by Thomas Sowell called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and that book essentially suggests that a lot of the pathologies that exist about single motherhood, for example, in the black community, or high rates of violence, are actually outgrowths of a slave and post-slave culture that was imposed by a white society that didn't bother with policing, that didn't care about inculcating morals or virtues in slaves. Obviously, they actually actively fought against it because they didn't want that to happen. And so there was an active fight from against assimilation by white people, and that created an underground culture that's really bad, and that exists in parts of white America too. It exists in Appalachia. So yes, I think bad cultures have nothing to do with race. I don't think that just because, this is why I'm saying I don't know why it borders on racism to say the cultures are bad. Like, some cultures are bad, some cultures are good, and that has nothing to do with race. Charles Murray wrote an entire book called Coming Apart about pathologies in white communities that are really destructive. So bad cultures do arise very often from historical circumstances, including historical discrimination. What I say is that today, there's nothing preventing an individual from superseding the culture in which you grew up and making good decisions. In a free country, somebody's going to have to break this chain. Somebody's going to have to break this cycle. And so, am I going to? I don't care if you want to say that the pathologies that exist in the black community, black inner city community of high rates of single motherhood and violence, for example, or lack of institutional wealth, that is a result of historic racism. I'm fine with you saying that. I don't have any problem with that. I'm not talking about historical racism when I talk about white privilege. I'm talking about right now the idea that there's a superstructure of rules and laws that are preventing you from succeeding, or a culture that is trying to keep you down. I don't think that's the case. So the question becomes, if you are here, let's say that on average, the culture in white America, or with regard to single motherhood, to take an example, is here, right? Because there's less single motherhood in the white community than the black community. And in the black community, it's here because it's 70% single motherhood rate, and the white community is 40%. Okay, so the question is, before, thanks to racism and thanks to discrimination, there was a cap on the black community that was here, and they couldn't get past it. Okay, now the ceiling's been removed. So what do you as an individual black person do to change your life? And I don't think it's helpful, and in fact I think it's actually quite hurtful, to spend an enormous amount of time talking about the legacy of discrimination and racism instead of talking about what can you do right now to fix your problem. Now, this is a general issue that I have in all of my relationships. When my wife comes to me and she says, there's a problem in my life, before we even have the conversation, I say to her, is this a listening conversation, or is this a you want me to fix it conversation? And I think that when it comes to politics, there should be far fewer listening conversations, like I want you to tell me about all the crap that's happened to you, because I don't care. I mean, I care, but it doesn't. But now the question is, what you going to do? Right? That's a much more important conversation, because we only have 5 minutes together. Is that 5 minutes going to be spent on all the terrible things that happened, which I fully agree with, that I would have fought if I were there, but I wasn't? Right? Are we going to spend 5 minutes talking about all the terrible things that happened to blacks and Jews and gays and women and Hispanics in the United States? Or are we going to talk about right now what you can do to succeed? Because I don't think that the rules are holding you back. So I've never, ever, at any point suggested that there's not been historic discrimination against black people, or even that current-day poverty is at least in part an outgrowth of that historic discrimination. What I have suggested is that if you are using that historic discrimination as a reason why you are not, as an individual human being, becoming more income mobile and not making good decisions, no one is making the call for you right now as an individual to get that girl pregnant. And that's the argument that I'm making.
Can I say one?
Sure, yeah.
So I guess, like, would you... Like, so you have to admit, though, that between different races and different cultures, there are different levels of success, and there's definitely, you would expect that somebody who grows up with being able less to succeed, you would expect that would happen in certain communities and certain
right. That's why they're called
communities.
pathologies of culture. Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you grew up in a worse situation than somebody else who grew up in a better situation, of course you're going to grow up having obstacles that other person has to overcome. But that doesn't mean that other person, number one, victimized you. Right? There's no one in America today, for example, who's enslaved a black person that I know of, or if they have, they'd be in jail. I'm sure that nobody in this room, right, none of the young white people in this room were alive during the times of Jim Crow. So the question is, do we take away from the white people in this room to rectify historic injustices, or do we recognize that history is filled with historic injustices, and now we're going to have to find a way to overcome those obstacles together without redistributing income, for example? Now, I have called for movements, for example, for companies to go into inner cities and make a deal with students in inner cities and say to them, listen, you get good grades and we'll pay for your college, and then you come afterward and you work for us for 3 years to pay off that debt. And I think there are things that we can do in the private sector. This is why I think religious communities are so important. I'm not against charity. I'm not against us as individuals going out and helping people. What I am against is the idea that the government can fix this problem, because the government cannot fix historic inequity. All the government can do is set the rules at an equal level, equal law, equal judgment under law, equal justice under law is the only way that we're ever going to approach anything that looks like a fair society. There's no such thing as a fair society where the government plays God and gives some to others and takes from others.
So would you say that we should, like, other people who are not, in an oppressed state, they should wait for other people to pull themselves up? Do you think that's how we should solve it, or do you think there is a moral
I think every culture in
responsibility?
American history, every individual in American history who has succeeded has had a combination of people who help them out, not in the government, people who help them out, and their own capacity to bootstrap it. And when my great-grandparents got here, they were dirt poor and didn't speak English. great-great-grandparents got here. They were dirt poor and didn't speak English. This is true for virtually everybody in the room, right? At some point, somebody came over here and they were dirt poor and didn't speak English. And that doesn't mean that on a generational level, people are going to go from 0 to 100. But it does mean that we're going to need to move in the right direction as opposed to sitting around and talking about historic injustice all day, because that doesn't get anything done. Thanks so much.
Hey, Ben. Very glad that you came here. Appreciate it. Listen to you a lot. I'm attending one of the health professional schools here at the U, and the prerequisites, of course, were like anatomy, physiology, biology, and yet...
Those are all offensive and terrible.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. We've discussed quite a bit about transgenderism and whatnot, even more than, say, cardiovascular disease. And we've even had assignments...
That makes perfect sense, yeah.
I know, right? We've even had assignments where you would get docked off or not get the points if you didn't say that you would, let's say, even change their gender in the medical profile to the gender that they say, which I think is just terrible. Considering
It's idiotic.
Yeah.
It's fully idiotic. If it says on your profile that you're a member of the sex to which you do not belong, then you are going to get profiled medically wrong.
Certainly.
Okay, if you are having lower stomach pain and it says on your chart that you are a man, we're going to be looking at indigestion. If it says you're a woman, we're going to be looking at something else. Okay, this is idiotic.
Yeah, so going off that, I guess you were starting to discuss it. I just wanted to know what your opinion was on sort of the implications of this, not only like a culturally significant issue that you've talked about, more invading into more hardcore science institutions,
Yeah.
especially considering your wife's a doctor.
Yeah, she is. As you may know, yeah. So I think that I think it's egregious. I think that biology is biology. It's amazing to me that people who proclaim that they are scientists are so willing to overlook basic biology and proclaim that people who are fully biologically male can magically become biologically female. We're not talking about people who are intersex. I always like when people who debate this issue immediately go to the marginal issues where their actual is blurring of the lines. People who are intersex or they have some genetic condition, they have Klinefelter syndrome or something, right? That's not what we're talking about here. The actual argument of the transgender civil rights movement is that people who are fully male can actually become fully female. That is obvious nonsense. It's obviously nonsense. And again, if you are the very idea that a doctor is supposed to sit there and profile you based on what you wish you were is so insane and stupid and counterproductive. I mean, if you're a transgender person, would you really want the doctor profiling you based along the lines of organs you don't have? If you're a biological man, do you want to walk into a doctor and he's trying to figure out how to fix your uterus? You don't have one. It's ridiculous. Okay, that stuff is just beyond the pale. But it does demonstrate the full-scale insanity that now predominates. And again, I've had this argument 1,000 times with folks, obviously, and the use of politics above science is obvious in everything from what you're talking about to even the rewriting of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the latest edition, which is completely ascientific, based on no statistical evidence, and was essentially a political decision to relabel gender dysphoria from a mental illness or mental disorder, was called a mental disorder, to it's not a mental disorder at all, it's just the depression associated with it that's a mental disorder. Well, by that definition, schizophrenia isn't a mental disorder. It's only the depression and suicidality that go along with it that are a mental disorder. You can literally do that with any mental disorder. So it's again, for people who proclaim that they care about science and facts, to say this kind of stuff is ascientific and afactual.
Hey, Ben. So I've listened to a lot of your content over the years, so I think I know most of your viewpoints on things, but one thing that I've never heard you explicitly bring up, and that, in my opinion, is going to becoming much more of an issue, is the legislation or lack thereof of artificial intelligence. Could you expand on your thoughts on that? Because there have been certain people who are calling for significant legislation on that, and others that are vehemently opposing it.
So as a libertarian, I'm pretty opposed to the idea of limiting the expansion into artificial intelligence. I think that there may be some moral issues involved. Well, once you get to Black Mirror level, where you're, quote unquote, creating individual human beings with the capacity to make decisions, for example, and do these things have some form of human rights? But I'm not sure that that's anywhere around the corner right now. These artificial intelligence systems are, they're great at certain things and really bad at others. So I think that's a bridge that we'll have to cross when we come to it. I don't think you have to foresee the moral problems coming. I think they will just show up. So I don't think we had to foresee the stem cell moral issue coming up until it came up, and then we had to deal with it. So preemptively guarding against technology that we haven't discovered yet is sort of self-defeating, because we can't predict every piece of technology that's going to come down the pipe. Plus, there's going to be a bunch of people who go around the law anyway to develop such technology, particularly when you're talking about computer technology and not just, like, it takes a fair amount of resources to do this in biology. I'm not sure that quite the same thing holds true when you have the capacity for the internet. You know, I'm less worried about technology than a lot of other folks. I know there are a lot of people who are worried that it's going to kill every job and that it's going to destroy human beings as we know it, and that Skynet's going to kill us all and all this. Yeah, maybe. But so far, that's been said about every technological development in the history of mankind, and then we've created new types of jobs. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is a difference in kind. Maybe it turns out that machines can think better than we do, and we can just turn everything over to them. Well, if that's the case, then we're going to have a lot of leisure time, won't we? Because these machines presumably will be good at making things that we like. We'll have basically the Star Trek replicator. And at that point, when all resources are no longer scarce but plentiful, then we can sit around and watch Vikings games.
Mr. Shapiro, thank you for coming out here. It's an honor to listen to you. I'm Bennett, and I am a junior in high school, part of the YAF chapter that we have. And just a question for you, kind of about, you know, it's been 2 months since the tax bill was passed, and just asking your perspective on, you know, only about 50% of American households pay taxes. And what is your perspective on that when all of a sudden everyone has an opinion on where taxes should be allocated, when only about 50% of households actually pay taxes, and just kind of your perspective on that?
So, just a quick correction, you mean income taxes. Yeah, federal income tax, only about 50% of American households pay federal income tax. Virtually all households pay some form of tax, right? They pay sales tax, or they pay state tax, or property tax, or that kind of stuff. So the answer is that it is bizarre to me that, you know, we should give a lot of credibility to the opinion of people who are not affected by a given policy, except that they get tax refunds from the government for taxes that they are not paying, for example. I always thought that the argument that was being made by Republicans on this, that all people in the country are going to get tax cuts, I thought the individual tax cut side was actually kind of dumb, because the people who are paying the tax in the country, as I mentioned in the speech, are largely at the upper end of the income bracket. They're not people who are at the lower end of the income bracket. So it's a problem. I mean, I do think that as we shift that burden more and more toward the upper end of the income spectrum, it's going to be very easy for the 70% of the public that's paying not very much tax to put all the tax burden on the other 30% of the public. And there's going to come a point where people at the upper end of the tax spectrum are sick of that, and they just start doing all their business offshore, which is one of the reasons why I was in favor of the tax cut. Not even because it would help me, because it wouldn't. I live in California. I actually pay more taxes under this tax bill. But because I think that it's important that we bring business back from overseas, and the only way to do that is to make the tax rates fiscally friendly to people who actually want to create jobs in the country.
Hi, Mr. Shapiro. Thank you for coming tonight. Just want to start by saying I was the chair of the College of Republicans here from 99 to 2000, former GOP staffer, and just want you to know I'm on the team. But now...
That
said, I work for the university now. And you've always been a champion for honest debate. I'm aware of both sides of the argument around you being in St. Paul tonight. With only one date to work with that you were available to be here, you were given the largest available room on campus. And I'm just wondering, your organizers of this event helped select the room. I have the emails to back that up. So isn't YAF threatening a First Amendment lawsuit about your location falling into the victim mentality that identity politics is based on?
So I will be honest with you. I've been taking the information I'm getting from YAF and from the students. So I assume they would tell a different story than the one that you're telling, because that's the story they've been telling me. If I look at both sides of the issue, and it turns out that that's the case, that you guys basically just came to an agreement, this is the best available place, that you couldn't find a bigger hall, that we actually needed 100 cops, you know, that all that is the case, then I'm more than happy to say that I think that that would be victim mentality and we shouldn't do that. What I am seeing is a pattern across the country of this sort of stuff happening on a routine basis, specifically citing security needs. And I think that that's something we have to take into account, and that's something that's dangerous. Like, this is not the first university where members of the general public have been, you know, there are a lot of universities where members of the general public have been barred. There are a lot of universities where they've shifted me to other smaller sites. There are lots of universities where they've canceled me outright. because of this. And so if in this situation that's not what's happening, I'm perfectly happy to retract my critique of the university. If the university legitimately did the best that it could, and you have the emails to back that up, and all of that, more than happy to say that it's inappropriate for anyone to go after you. More than happy to do that. But there is a heckler's veto of the state, and it's also possible that you guys didn't do anything wrong, but what's happening is that security situations are becoming so complex because of the left and because of what they're doing that it's a bad situation for everybody all around. My suggestion is, again, I'm from the outside. All I can see is that I walked through a room downstairs with literally 100 police officers in it. I don't know if there are any protesters outside. My guess is probably not. If there are very few. It's cold. By my standards, and so if you're going to staff 100 police officers, it seems weird to me that we can't do it at a hall that holds 1,200 people as opposed to 500. But again, as I say, if you show me the evidence, I'm more than happy to change my opinion on it.
All right, this will be the last question.
Hey, Ben. With the current Republican Congress unable to pass much of the conservative agenda, such as repealing Obamacare, repealing DACA, and lowering the budget, do you think that there will be a conservative movement in the future that reduces the scope of government dramatically, or will conservatives have to continue to sacrifice their larger wants in order to get smaller victories, like the end of chain migration and repeal of the individual mandate?
I mean, I think that for the moment, smaller victories are basically what's in the offing. I think that in the future, circumstances change, and we're in for some pretty hard times. And I'm talking about particularly the deficit. Right now, people are just ignoring the fact that the national debt is up to $21 trillion. When Bill Clinton left office, it was $5.2 trillion. That is a shocking multiplication. And every nation that has ever had this kind of debt in proportion to its GDP ends up having to take some sort of austerity measures. So those austerity measures are coming. The only question is when they're going to happen. And Democrats aren't going to put those in place. So that means that as circumstances change, it's up to us to stand out there with the sign saying the end is near, even when people are saying that things are booming and growing all over the place. It's one of my chief critiques of the policy of the Trump administration is that they've been utterly uninterested in entitlement reform, which is, I think, the single most important thing that the government could actually do at this point. And Republicans are running away from it headlong because they're afraid of losing elections. At a certain point, you're going to have to you're going to have to sack up, guys, and actually do something important as opposed to passing tiny bits of legislation that are supposed to please us. Well, thanks so much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.